When the phrase the Dark Ages is muttered, is this the first sword that comes to your mind to represent this brutal age of humanity? Greetings, old friends. It's good to be back. Today we'll look at this Cleaver Falchion of Elmslie type F1a by Tod Cutler. This is one of the newest batches developed by Tod of Tod's Workshop, very popular YouTube channel and historical arms and armor recreationist. Usually works with film and TV streaming shows on authentic medieval arms and armor. This is this one model in the second batch of Tod Cutler sword series. The Cleaver Falchion hails from the early 13th century of Western Europe. Actually, the phrase Dark Ages refer to the earlier medieval times, which is the centuries prior to the 10th. At the time, big single-edged swords or large knives such as the Viking sacks were used primarily. And there wasn't many single-edged swords. Maybe there are some single-edged ones mounted on Viking sword hilts. However, in the 13th century, we do see many manuscripts, treatises making up the lack of records in the Dark Ages. There are lots of representations in illuminated illustrations featuring this kind of sword, usually used by foreign enemies other than European origins. And they obviously have a very brutal, savage look. And you can see this falchion, sometimes referred to as the Cleaver Falchion. It's a Elmslie F1a. Obviously, that's one of the earliest falchion found in Europe, but also the most iconic one, the F1a is. The other Type 1 subcategories have very different tip types, such as chopped off squarish tip. That's not for thrusting at all, but if you look at this Type 1a, you can already see the tip is at a 60 degree and also canted away from the direction of the spine. Therefore, everyone look at this can instantly see that this is a cutting-oriented sword and thrusting is not the primary purpose. Now, in recent decades, bullhead and some medieval melees, medieval themed melee, should we say, became very popular, and Type 1a falchions are featured heavily. They're not really made properly, they're just blunt instruments, more like maces and axes, because those are bent. As you can imagine, even if they are blunt, they can cause a lot of damage if you smack someone on the head with those, even through the helmet. Therefore, very heavy falchions without a lot of distal taper or proper mass distribution became very popular among the bullhead, league or circle. People started to spread some misinformation, such as these falchions are a hybrid between swords and axes, which can't be further from the truth, right? If you look at the geometry of this very authentic reproduction, you can see the spine is quite thick, between 5 and 6 millimeters, and it tapers down very rapidly, down to little over 1 millimeters, which is kind of incredible, right? This is not really seen on other types of medieval swords, such as arming swords. Even if they are tapered down dramatically near the ideal cutting portion, they still retain 2 or 3 millimeters, except for some very extreme examples. However, falchions, especially the Type 1a, that has a very dramatic upward profile taper, meaning that it becomes much wider in the ideal cutting portion near the tip than the base. They have to compensate the increase of width by drastically reducing the thickness in this plane. So on the upper portion, if you look at it, it's merely a sheet of steel. However, at the base, it's very strong. So the mass distribution still dictates a very lively handling characteristics. If you can just look at the overall amount of steel on this falchion at the lower portion, it's still a lot less than the upper portion, because at the base it's more than 3 times as thick, and the base is a little more than half the width. Therefore, on the upper portion, overall the mass is still about 50 to 60% of the base, right? So this overall, the amount of steel still tapers down, and it's not particularly long, because this is based on one of the most prominent F1a examples, the Cluny Falchion, housed at the Cluny Museum in Paris. The other two being a little bit larger, the Cleaver Falchion, currently housed at the Durham Cathedral and the Hamburg Museum example in Germany. They are larger and generally wider, but this one is a more delicate example, weighs a little bit more than 900 grams, so that's just over 2 pounds. This example comes under 1 kilogram, because the original misses the grip. Obviously, when you add some wood and leather on it, some loss of steel on the antique example is compensated on a reproduction. It's a little bit heavier, so this is a very accurate representation of the shorter variant of Type 1a, very heavily featured in manuscripts of early 13th century, usually paired with either a buckler or more often a shield, what we call a heater shield today. And the hilt is basically identical to most of the 13th century arming swords, a quillon, maybe slightly upswept, and then a wheel pommel, definitely. And this wheel pommel by Tod Cutler is designed to be a little bit different than the wheel pommel found on Cluny Falchion, which is a very flat and big, with big diameter at the end, made of bronze. So that's a very adequate counterweight. This one, however, is much thicker, but has a smaller diameter, a more generic arming sword type of pommel, more than adequate to counterbalance the overall blade presence, but also serves as a pretty good hand stop. When you have to draw this, you can just, your hand can latch onto the wheel without looking at it, and you can draw very easily. And this is an extremely handy sword, very lightweight, because the point of balance is also quite low, between 3 and 4 inches from the crossguard. Therefore, it's very lively, very quick because of the short length. If you look at late medieval falchions, this one I reviewed before, the Angstrom type F4, F4e. You can look at the size difference, and this one actually weighs about the same as this F1a falchion. And you can see here, this one happens to be also quite popular in French-speaking regions. It's called a French medieval falchion by Angstrom, featured heavily in the Mirror of History manuscript. And you can see this is a lot larger, a lot longer than the Cleaver Falchion. At the base, it's almost identical in width. And then this one flares up so much, while the F4e falchion maintains mostly the width, except for on the upper portion. You can see it has a step on the spine, so it becomes a little bit wider. Purpose-wise, we can look at a trace of early falchion, late medieval falchion. They are all very, very thin on the upper portion, just over 1 millimeter, which is hard to believe. You know, these very wide but thin swords, they are good at one thing, that's chopping down unarmored combatants, right? Some people look at boothard combat and they infer that these are mace or axe-like weapons, which cannot be further from the truth, because a blade this thin on the cutting portion, which is this, where the belly is, the widest portion of the blade, the bevel is very delicate because it tapers down like a V-shaped wedge. Therefore, it has very thin edges, right? It doesn't have a lot of thickness to back up the strength of the blade. If you chop down into something like plate armor, well, it stands a pretty good chance it will be damaged significantly. It will roll and maybe even bend or break. Similar to this late medieval falchion, but in the early 13th century, there weren't really plate armor. There were some rudimentary cold plates, so large steel plates in the back of the circle of knights or men-at-arms. So they are basically placed into the sewn pockets of these circles on the inside. If you chop down onto a plated circle, cold plates with this kind of sword, obviously it wouldn't do much, and it can potentially damage the edge. However, in the early 13th century, there were many combatants on the battlefield. They are basically very poorly trained. They are not well equipped, just peasant levies with bills or spears in large number, right? Therefore, if you as a knight or man-at-arms could afford cold plates and some basic early, joint protections like the cutter or the pauline for the knees, you're covered enough from head to toe with mail armor. Otherwise, obviously, cutting against a well-equipped knight or man-at-arms with, this kind of sword still wouldn't do much. Maybe on the clavicle, there's some impact damage, but this is not a very long blade, right? You could pick up a mace easily. They are short, much shorter, but basically at arm's length, you can do a lot more damage to someone's bony parts, than these falchions can. So these are more than armor choppers. They are rather people choppers, right? This phrase coined by Matt Easton of Scholar Gladiatoria. They are not really used against armored opponents, not even mailed armor. They cannot hope to chop through riveted steel links. Therefore, this is another example of asymmetric warfare. If you're a well-equipped armored knight, probably not just armor, but also a heater shield, you're well-equipped, well-protected, you can afford using one of these swords, right? Maybe a backup weapon even, at your side, because they are very short, easy to carry, rather than axe or maces, warhammers. So they are definitely delicate slicers rather than axe-like choppers. And we can look at this example recreated by Tod, by his contractor, that is. Tod's workshop produced weapons made by Tod himself, whereas Tod Cutler just have all sorts of contractors making swords of his design, very rigorous requirements that has to be met. And we look at this example, there's one disclaimer on his website saying these very thin-bladed swords are hell to forge, right? It's actually quite complex because some people look at this, they'll think it's similar to a machete or cleaver, which is not really the case. You have very iconic V-shaped wedge from the spine all the way to the edge. Not to mention there are other mechanisms such as fullers. And the very dramatic distal taper means that all these have to be forged out. They cannot be just a flat sheet metal and grind some bevel near the edge like a machete. Very, very, very low budget farming and agricultural tools, right? These are weapons of war. So whereas machetes, you don't really have to worry about trees or vines, branches fighting back at you. Whereas with these swords, you have to defend yourself with. Therefore, you can see it has to be very nimble, very responsive, and the mass distribution and the cross-section ensures that. Also, they are much more efficient cutting tools than the regular machete, just a thin sheet of metal, and then have a very short bevel. This one, the bevel starts from the spine all the way to the edge. On the upper portion, it's a little bit atypical, because the thickest part is actually not the spine, but near here. And then it tapers down a little bit in thickness. So at the spine, it's only 1 millimeter thick. However, the entire blade, the thickest part is about 1.2, 1.3 millimeters at the widest portion of the blade. I reviewed fantasy falchion inspired by the Kanye falchion, designed by my friend brother Nathaniel before, and that's a longer example. That one didn't really manage this degree of distal taper well. Therefore, it still has a very good degree of distal taper. It just on the upper portion, it's still just under 3 millimeters, whereas this one really achieved 1 millimeter. Therefore, it's inevitable that hand-forged blade will have some irregularity on the blade. So on the Falchion's webpage, it states that because of the difficulty forging these blades, there are always some undulations on the surface of the blade, and you can look at it's not really flat. You can see a lot of waviness. So that comes from the hammer forging, but most importantly, the difficulty grinding a blade this flat, this wide, and this thin, because you don't want to overgrind and make it vulnerable. Some of the antique examples, after centuries, there are some corrosions. You can see some places are perforated, especially on the upper portion, the thinner part, which is a hole just rusting through the steel. So we do know that they are very thin on the upper portion, and at the base, they have to be very thick. And this reproduction is perfect. However, it is true that if you look at the edge, you can see some minor warping. I wouldn't say as bad as sabering. The whole blade is not perfect. This is very accurate, very faithful to antique originals. However, in modern reproduction standards, this might bother modern customers. Therefore, unless you are a true medievalist and antiquarian and you want antique Falchion's qualities, some of the characteristics, this might not be your first choice. I do know some other high-end custom makers. They can do a better job at making the grinding more even. However, you're going to pay very handsomely for that kind of labor. Probably you're going to pay, 5 or 6 times as much. I should mention that the price of this Falchion is between $500 and $600 US dollars. So you probably will spend $3,000 on a custom Falchion by true expert at single edge stores such as James Elmslie. The typology was devised by Elmslie himself. And let's look at some other traits. One very prominent characteristic of Type 1 Falchion discovered by Elmslie is that the center line of the blade is not actually aligned with the center line of the grip, meaning that you should not have a blade, because it tapers upward, right? It's like a radius. It should not taper so that the center is the entire center of the blade, meaning that this side, the edge side, will tilt more this way. And I should tell you that the rate of profile taper, the way it widens, is not linear, meaning that it becomes wider faster and faster as it approaches this part. Therefore, if you look at the silhouette of this Falchion, you can see that there's almost a reverse, recurved edge forward. And you can also see on the upper portion, the tip is slightly, tilted this way. So the tip is not completely upswept away from your hand. You can still do some jabbing, and again, people protected by merely closing, very thin hoses, etc. You can still do a lot of damage because it's very wide and very thin. Once it jabs in, you can open up a wound very fast. Additionally, this surface, you can look at that, it's at a very interesting angle, 60 degrees angle with the back of the spine. Therefore, if you chop down this way and you don't extend your arm forward, you can see this surface, right, is relatively small compared to the rest of the edge. But this is aligned with the surface of enemy combatant's torso. So you can do a tip cut, and this will concentrate all the force on this small area, do essentially a tip cut. Therefore, if the enemy is protected by newer technology in terms of the early 13th century gambeson, layered hardened linen or cotton, right, as protection, those are very resilient against cuts because there are so many layers, like dozens of layers. Therefore, to cut through that, sometimes you have to concentrate the force, and then this region will help you with that. But also, if you land here, you see the contact surface is also smaller. Rather than a sword like this, fairly straight, there's some curve on the upper portion, but if you cut over here while the edge is fairly flat. Therefore, there's a larger surface bearing into the body of your opponent. Because the torso, many parts is relatively flat, it's a large surface, you don't really concentrate the force. Therefore, you have a slightly lesser chance of slicing open, bite into the surface, and open up the protective layers. This geometry of falchion is ideal slicer cleaver. Whereas this type of falchion, F1a, from later centuries, they are very lively swords. They are focused on very fast acceleration. Now this Tod Cutler F1a falchion is no slouch, right? It's a correct mass distribution for you to accelerate, but you can feel there's definitely some choppiness, right? There's mass because you simply cannot negate this kind of width. On the upper portion, it's between 6 and 7 centimeters wide. That's almost unheard of on medieval swords because it usually taper down a lot. So at this portion, they are already much narrower. Therefore, with this width and this very thin blade, you have a very refined edge bevel with a V-shaped wedge. Of course, it's not completely V-shaped, especially on this one. It has a secondary bevel. Secondary bevel are usually found on Tod Cutler's work, but they are blended in with the apple seating. This one, not so much. You can see where it transitions. Although the geometry, upon touch, you can feel that it's still blended in very well. There's no discernible ledge, so it wouldn't suddenly increase the resistance the blade meets. As long as the edge bites into the surface, it will cut open, meet very little resistance afterwards. And it also features fuller, just like a Clooney falchion, and the width of the fuller happens to be tapered as well. So on the upper portion is thinner. So this is some complexity of the geometries. You look at the grind of fuller, there's a lot of wavy lines, right? Undulation, indeed, which is in the disclaimer of the product page. So it doesn't really bother me that much, and I can see on original examples, they all have this trait, right? Because it's not possible for 13th century swordsmiths to have machine-like precision, right? And I should mention that falchions are usually not used by low-status troops. They are a relatively high status, I would say mid to high status weapon, because to use it, sometimes you have to sacrifice some reach. Therefore, you basically forego some protections because reach is protection, right? There are this much more steel to cover the line for you to parry and block. Whereas this one, it's responsive, it's fast, but it wouldn't be the most handy thing to parry with. Therefore, you do have some protection on your body to begin to consider using this kind of sword, right? Well, namely, a full suit of mail armor. So that was already very expensive, very unaffordable. That dictates that the wearer of this kind of sword already are wealthy knights, men-at-arms, and then you probably have some plated components like coat plates, joint protections, maybe even some plated forearms protection, and gray helm. Therefore, you can, forget about defense, especially when the shield is more passive at your side, and you can just chop down relentlessly at these peasant levies. So, very faithful reproduction. I'm very happy to own one of these by Tod Cutler. The other very interesting model is Swiss Degen. Also, another model in the second batch of Tod Cutler's sword line. I'm going to review that one very soon. And we're going to do a lot of test cutting with this one. I predict that it will do very well. That's the purpose of this kind of sword, because especially when it's so faithfully reproduced. You can listen to the ringtone when you knock on the blade. Not as high as the harmonics on swords made by someone like Angstrom, right? But it's still very, very good in terms of harmonics, meaning that the hilt mounting is very sound, very solid, but also the mass distribution. The mass distribution is correctly done. It has all the harmonic properties. It has some flex, but not a lot. It flexes in the right place. So the point of percussion is exactly here, just below the widest portion. I would think that this part doesn't flex as much. It will be very stable when you cut into the target. So this part will do really well with such a delicate edge bevel. And you flex the blade. There's some flex, of course, on the upper portion being so thin, but when the blade is short, 22 inches long, it doesn't really flex that much. So it will be a very good cutter in one hand. Hilt mounting quality is just on par with premium lines such as LB and swords. The geometry of the wheel pommel is fine. There's no tapering, but it's fine. Many of the originals are uniform in thickness. The pin is very completely done. You can see it's not like a very uniform circle, like round shape, but it's rounded, and you can see the pinning. You can modify it by grind out the pin. So this is all very well, has a satin finish on the fittings. So it's pretty, thoughtfully designed. And also you can see there are some geometry, some tapering on the cross guard, slightly up sweat. The opening of the guard is not as tight as it can be, but it fits the blade very well. The blade is seated into the slot, so that's all it matters. Look at the grip, it's really lovely. This one is light brown. You can choose some other colors such as green, red, but this one it's pretty generic, medieval kind of color. You can see the geometry of the grip. There's some tapering, sweating in the center of the grip. Very ergonomic, right? 4 risers, 2 at the bottom, 2 on top, and they are very rounded, very comfortable, provide enough tractions, and they look great. Look like premium reproduction swords. There's no gap between the grip, transition to the guard. You can see the riser envelopes the side of the guard. So it looks like a very well executed grip, just like the ones on LB and swords. The skiving, the leather is well done. The seam, you can feel it, but it doesn't really stick out. Very nice. Check this out.
Nice.
So some observation after the test cutting. Obviously, this blade that has the center line crooked slightly, curved towards the direction of the edge, give it a little bit more authority when you swing it. The keenness of the edge is not exactly razor sharp, right? Not like a removing hair level, but it's quite adequate. Coming out of the workshop, has a very pronounced secondary bevel, and you can see the visible shoulder. I improved it a little bit on a belt sander, but still, I wouldn't say it will reach its peak cutting potential with the secondary bevel. Although you can argue that the blade is already very thin, nearly 1 millimeter, at 1 inch from the bevel, so it doesn't really matter that much. And you can see the mass distribution of the sword being so wide, over 3 inches wide, close to 80 millimeters at the broadest section of the blade, really adds a lot of authority. And this sword is very easy to accelerate, right? Being so short and has a very close point of balance. Also, it's kind of thick. So this mass distribution dictates that it's a very fast sword, yet it's still authoritative, which is kind of different from many other, shorter swords like Messers, etc. So they are a little bit more sluggish and doesn't have such oomph, such choppiness, or natural, just momentum. So definitely an easy sword to use, right? Whether you accelerate it very fast, like at a short distance or so, or give it a full-throated swing. However, the broad blade can be a little bit of, nuisance to control. If there's any, change of direction when you make the cut, let's say when you pass through the target, and it's a secret target, right? A torso or upper arm that you wouldn't just pass through immediately. This rest of the blade, if you turn it even slightly, it will get stuck in the target because it wouldn't pass through as easy, as fast as a narrower blade, right? So that could be a problem. However, if you're just doing simple chopping motions, right, that's not going to be a problem because it's traveling in a straight line, right? And it's easier to control the edge alignment. So that's about it, what I can say about this specific model. Oh, and the steel used, quite durable, but it's very prone to stain. You can see all these rust spots appearing on the surface of the blade after some light cutting, juice spots. Maybe there's some acidity in the water, but it's only surface level, right? It's not deep rust, so should be easier to clean up. But the steel used is quite adequate. High carbon steel, etc. Has the correct edge retention. So I would say that I'm quite happy with this model, and this is a rare type for some reason on the reproduction market because it's somewhat hard to get right, being so thin on the upper portion, having a dramatic distal taper, right? It's harder to have the smiths control their, rate of banging on the upper portion. You don't want to make it too thin, but it has to be quite thin, right? Like if you look at the spine, that's about less than a quarter of the base thickness. So definitely not an easy sword to get right. So there you go, the Tod Cutler Cleaver Falchion from the 13th century. A very nice reproduction, and I can highly recommend it if you just acquire it for collector's purpose, having a representation of each type of the falchion, or you use it as some regular test cutting practice implement, etc. Very handy, right? A pleasant sword to play with. So there you go, the Tod Cutler 13th century Cleaver Falchion. And if you enjoyed this video, any value or entertainment, please like and subscribe.